Here again. Enjoy doing these classes. So today is probably my favorite topic on the gut-brain connection. And I'll give you a little background on why it's my favorite topic. But what we'll be going into in this is how our gut health influences our mental health, how we feel, our emotions, our behaviors, and then how that is also reflected back to the microbiome and impacts our gut health. It's like this circular thing that is connected largely through our vagal nerve, which runs from our brain to our gut. And we're going to get into a lot more details on all of that. So Magda gave me an introduction. My practice is Evolve Wellness and Counseling. And I'll share a little bit on how I kind of came into doing what I'm doing and why I really love doing classes on the gut-brain connection, which is because some of you maybe have heard this, my story before, but the first bite of food my mom gave me as an infant was plain yogurt, and it sent me to the hospital. And the doctor said that I would probably have a lot of allergies and, food reactions growing up, and they were right. And it was so normal that I just was very used to breaking out in hives, popping Benadryl. I would have friends be like, "Are you okay?" And I'm like, yeah, it's just this hive thing that happens. I wouldn't know what I ate. Later, I figured it out, but we didn't have as much information, I think, in the 80s about food sensitivities and all of that. So unless it was like a full-blown allergy, I don't think we really knew what to do so well as we do now. So the interesting thing is that it was just allergies for a really long time. And I don't think I realized I was bloated, but I definitely had some gut stuff going on. And under the surface, there was a lot of issues with my microbiome that I didn't know about until I got older and it started turning into anxiety. And because I was sort of afraid of what to eat through my teen years, I started having some issues with disordered eating and my relationship with food. And as I got older, then I really started noticing the gut problems as I got into my 20s. And so at some point, I did my searching around online and found a nutritionist who said she worked with people with gut issues and it helped with mental health. And so from early on, was kind of cued into like, maybe there's this connection. And that was my first experience going to someone and getting help for those things. And I won't go through the whole journey because it was a journey of healing, but it had to do with figuring out what was happening in my microbiome that had initiated, 70% of our immune system is in our gut. And that had initiated this immune response, these allergies. And over time, that started affecting, my neurotransmitters. We have more than 95% of our serotonin is stored in our gut. And so, that's a neurotransmitter that helps us feel good. And so that can affect how we're feeling mentally and emotionally and so on and so on. We're going to get into some more of these connections, but I definitely experienced that. And still to this day, I can tell when my gut starts to get a little bit off. For me, the first impact I get is energy related. I can feel really tired or I can feel kind of anxious. And so there's this mental health component that shows up. For other people, they may not get those symptoms of that, that gut brain connection as quickly, but I always did. So I got really, really fascinated by this connection, which we're going to go into today in more depth. So what organ of the body produces 3/4 of the neurotransmitters? The gut. The gut also is the organ that contains 2/3 of immune tissue. Talked about that. And it has 10. So this is actually, so sorry, I need to update that next one. It has possibly up to 10 times more cells than the rest of the body combined. What we more recently understand is it's at least 1-to-1. So for every human cell, we have one bacterial cell living in or on the body. So I always think if we could, see, just like we can do x-rays and see our bones, our skeleton, if we could do a picture of all of us and just see the bacteria and not see our human cells, we would just look like a human walking pile of bacteria, but there would be a large concentration in our gut area, a lot more concentrated right there. And then we have 100 to 150 times larger of a genome in the microbiome than the human genome. And initially, there was the Human Genome Project, right? And so we learned a whole lot about genetics. And later came the Microbiome Project, which wasn't that long ago. I think I actually have the date in here as we go through the slides. And through that is when we started learning so much more about the microbiome. And it takes a very, very long time for research to become public health recommendations, 20 plus years sometimes. So we have a lot more information, but it's not always incorporated into our standard of care in healthcare yet. Hopefully, as we continue to learn, we can find ways to, incorporate this into our own healthcare practices or habits. Sorry, I'm just moving a couple things around on my screen so I can see a little bit better. Can everybody still see the PowerPoint?
I have a quick side. Somebody's asking, what is microbiome? I think we should address it.
Yes, really good question. So I'll go through a few things that I'm going to say today that maybe you haven't heard before. When we talk about the bacteria in our gut or on our body, we are talking about our microbiome. So our microbiome is all the bacteria that lives in our body, on our body, and then our microbiota is another word that gets used, and that's the bacteria itself. The microbiome is like all of it together, kind of the family of microbiota. If we say the gut microbiome, we're just talking about the bacteria that lives in the gut, in the digestive system. So, and if I say anything else, please do put it in the chat box. I have it up in front of me and I'll try to watch that. Or Magda, you can jump in and like you just did. One other thing I meant to say at the beginning is that, and I'll say this again at the end, but in case anybody has to go early, I have an email list. I'm trying to get out like an article a week on something related to functional nutrition. And so if you want to be on that email list and get those articles, feel free to put your email in the chat box and just put email list or add me, and I'll save the chat at the end and add you to that. So just letting you know, you can do that if you'd like. It's also on my website. Okay, so trillions of bacteria inhabit every part of our body. As I mentioned, we have one bacterial cell for every human cell. The microbes that are present in our gut depend on many, many factors. They are going to depend on our genes, our mother's microbiota. So what bacteria did our mom have when we were in utero? The other microbes, the microbes that are in the bodies of the other people that we're living with, that we grew up with, that we live with now, affect our own microbiome. Your diet, your brain's activity, and your state of mind all affect our bacteria. There are 100,000 times more microbes in your gut alone as there are people on Earth. So these little things living in and on us, we have largely, I heard Dr. William Davis wrote a book called Super Gut. And he's the same guy that wrote the book Wheat Belly. Not sure if any of you have seen that one. But he has a new book called Super Gut, which is really great. And he has a lot of awesome fermented food recipes in there. So if you want to check that out, it's a good resource. And he talks about how, over the past decades, we've largely ignored this bacteria, right? And why would there be 100,000 times more bacteria in our gut than people on Earth if it didn't mean something, if it wasn't important for our health in some way? And for the most part, we've kind of ignored it. We've just gone in and thrown antibiotics at it and kind of blown it all up, right? Because we're trying to get to the bad stuff, but we forget and ignore all the good stuff. And the good stuff does so much for us. If we were to weigh all this bacteria, it would weigh 3 to 4 pounds. So if you think about that, that's a lot. These microbes actually listen as our brain signals to the gut how stressed we are, when we're happy, when we're angry, when we're anxious. And they do this even when we're not fully aware of our emotional state. They are listening. And they also generate and modulate signals that the gut then sends back up to the brain, which can reinforce or sometimes even prolong the emotional state that we're in. So interestingly, when we're angry, when we're anxious, our gut like twists and spews mucus, and there's a lot of movement in there. And we talk about that in our language, right? We say like it was gut wrenching. When we're depressed, it's very quiet. And sometimes people we've have in our language, right? Like it feels like I had a rock in my stomach. Like it just feels heavy. And that is actually what's happening to our intestines when we're in those different emotional states. So with all this bacteria in there, in exchange for us housing that bacteria in our guts, those microbes kind of pay rent by doing a lot of different things that support the health of our body. And some of those things we might not otherwise be able to do on our own. One of them is that they support a healthy immune system. As I mentioned, there's 70% of our immune system resides in the gut. So it's no surprise that all this bacteria in our gut is interacting with our immune system. This bacteria educates your immune system on how to function properly. It helps promote more specifically, and this gets a little sciencey, but it can influence homeostasis of the immune system by helping our T regulatory cells to work better. And what that's doing is it's regulating the immune system, because we don't want an overactive immune system, but we don't want an underactive immune system. So this bacteria helps it be balanced in its response. We want it to kind of act when it's launch an immune response when there's a problem, but then calm down when there's not, so we don't have chronic inflammation. This bacteria also supports digestion and absorption. So some bacteria can produce enzymes that help with carbohydrate breakdown, that help with other aspects of digestion. They can also help liberate minerals to be absorbed. So it can help with calcium and magnesium absorption. Bacteria helps to fight pathogens. So we tend to think of when we swallow some food as now it's in our body, but it's actually not. Our digestive system is almost like a donut hole, right? All the way from our mouth and all the way out. And so things aren't in our body until they get absorbed through the gut lining and then into circulation in the body. And part of what this bacteria does is in the gut, we have our gut cells, and I'm going to kind of show it like with my fingers here. So if these are our gut cells, we have these little tight junctions between the gut cells that hold them nice and tight so that things can't slip through that aren't supposed to. And then right out here, we have this mucus. And it sounds like, we hear the word mucus, it's like, but that mucus in the gut is so, so important. On a stool test, when I get labs on people, we can see what's going on with that mucus. It's called secretory IgA, is the immune component that's in that mucus. It protects our gut. And then over here in the gut, we've got all of this bacteria, and there's a lot of bacteria right here around the edge of this mucosal lining. And that bacteria is helping to protect the mucosal lining. The mucosal lining is protecting the gut lining. And so if in a healthy situation, we've got all this good bacteria, and if we swallow some not so great bacteria, some pathogenic bacteria, problematic bacteria, in a healthy gut, first, it's going to hit our stomach acid. And if our stomach acid is sufficient, that stomach acid's going to kill that bacteria before it ever even makes it to the intestines. But it's really common to have low stomach acid. Stress can cause low stomach acid. A lot of people are on proton pump inhibitors, which are stomach acid reducing medication, which can help with the symptom of reflux, but it does reduce acid. And then we get, bacteria that can get into the intestines. And when it gets down there, we hope we've got this really great bacteria to get on top of it and take care of it. That good bacteria will kind of fight or have an effect to bring down that bad bacteria. And so then we protect our gut lining. And this bacteria, it stays healthy by getting fed. And what feeds it is prebiotics, which would be asparagus, onions, fiber in food. And if it's getting enough of that, then and we're maybe taking in some fermented foods, and I'll circle back to like these takeaways at the end. But if we're getting those fermented foods in also, then it gets fed and it's healthy, and it can do that job of taking care of negative stuff in there and protecting the gut lining and helping synthesize vitamins and helping facilitate digestion and absorption. But if it's not getting fed, let's say we're on a standard American diet, we're having sandwiches without veggies on them, maybe burgers and French fries, right? I think the average vegetable intake in the United States is 1 serving. It was like 0.8 servings to 1.5 servings of vegetables a day. And they included potatoes and tomatoes. So a lot of people counted French fries and ketchup as their serving of vegetables. So it's pretty low, right? A lot of people aren't getting enough food for that bacteria. So that bacteria starts to die, and it doesn't want to die. It wants to find something to eat, and it can eat the mucosal lining. There's certain strains like Akkermansia can be really beneficial in the body, but if it's not getting fed, it will start eating that mucosal lining. And if that mucosal lining gets eaten, we don't have that protection. For one, our immune system is getting a little bit compromised in the gut, and that protection of the gut lining is getting compromised. And that bacteria or any other toxins or bad bacteria that's in there can now get to the edge of the gut. And eventually those little tight junctions, we can get inflammation. And so in here, where these gut cells were nice and tight, they start getting loose. And this is the picture of leaky gut. We've got not a great immune system. Our bacteria is kind of out of balance. We've got some spaces and gaps between the gut cells. And so stuff can kind of slip through into the bloodstream that's not supposed to be there. And we can look for leaky gut with a few lab tests. One is called lipopolysaccharide, LPS. That shouldn't get out into the gut unless there's some of leaky gut. And so if we see that in the bloodstream, we know that there's some issues in the gut. And then we can dig deeper and see what those are. So I wanted to go through that just so you can understand this whole process of digestion and what that leaky gut term means and what's going on with all this bacteria and what it does when it's healthy and how much it can do in there. So our gut, as we mentioned, we've already talked about immune system in the gut. And it also is a big place where our nervous system is housed, right? There's 100 million nerve cells in the gut. So tons of messages going to and from our gut. And in Ayurveda is an ancient Indian medicine. It's similar to Chinese medicine. They're very different, but one grew out of the other. And Ayurveda has been around for a long time. And in Ayurveda, they say that all disease begins in the nervous system. Hippocrates said all disease begins in the gut. And they both make a lot of sense to me because the nervous system and the gut are so connected. And what got me to go back to school for counseling is working with people on their gut health. And I started to just sometimes sense, or we would have a conversation about their stress. And it's like we were working with nutrition, we were working on the microbiome, but we kept going in circles because stress and nervous system dysregulation kept causing us to get back into the same situation. And so we can get pretty far in supporting gut health by also simply working on nervous system regulation. And I say simply, it's probably one of the hardest things, I think, because we co-regulate to the people around us and the experiences that we're having in our nervous system growing up. And so shifting that is very possible, but it is very slow and it takes time. And so not to say it's easy, but it can have a big impact on improving gut health. Our gut has its own nervous system, the enteric nervous system. And I mentioned that 95% of our serotonin is stored in our gut. And these serotonin containing cells are influenced by what we eat and by chemicals released from certain species of gut microbes. They're also affected by signals that our brain is sending to them about our emotional state. So they're going to respond based on like what our brain is saying too. And the cells are tightly connected to nerves that then, guess what? Send it back to the brain, right? Back and forth, back and forth. I just think this is a cool little piece of information that when spread out, our gut is the size of a basketball court. So if we have, endocrine cells, so that's hormone cells that are sending hormonal messages, we've got all these serotonin containing cells, we've got all this immune system. I mean, all of that takes a lot of surface, right? It's why when we look at the intestines, it's like really long and there's a lot of surface area. So spread out, it's the size of a basketball court. We call the gut the second brain. And interestingly, when we talk about the information going between the brain and the gut, 90% of that information being sent is going north, which was shocking to me when I heard that. I figured it would be more north to south, but it's actually more going up to our brain. And more, and in addition, that gut and brain communication is happening via our hormones. There's inflammatory molecules that send messages, which is also really interesting because I don't know if any of you here have had this experience, but I've heard this from people before. I've seen it. One of my kids has this happen, that if he gets sick, he has like anxiety for a little bit towards the end of being sick. And then it kind of resolves. It's like kicks up his, he just will wake up at night having bad dreams and sort of a little bit of panic or anxiety. And I've heard different people say that it's like this messages of that inflammatory process happening that's trying to deal with the illness and then resolve it, sends some messages that the brain receives as, or ends up making us feel anxiety. You can raise your hand if you feel like sharing and you've had that experience. Gut sensation is another thing that's going north that's sent up to the brain. And then there are signals sent back to the gut to adjust its function based on that information. There are tense gut feelings that are stored in databases in the brain, which can be accessed later when making decisions. And they play a role in the generation of our emotions. So we store that information too when we have sort of like tightness or tenseness in the gut to help figure out what are we feeling emotionally later based on what we're sensing in our gut. Our gut mirrors every emotion that arises in the brain. And I mentioned that if you were driving, let's say, and somebody cuts in front of you and it kind of scares you, and then you feel frustrated, like, oh, why did they do that? They're not paying attention. So we have the fuming or at least the frustration happening, and our gut, whether we're aware of it or not, can have vigorous contractions that increase the production of stomach acid, slow the emptying of scrambled eggs maybe that we ate at breakfast. And there's digestive juices and mucus that start flowing. And that happens when we're angry, upset, anxious, or fearful. And then, another phrase we have, right, is butterflies in the stomach. You might say that, or the gut wrenching, or like I said, when we're depressed, the intestines will hardly move at all. So, I see a lot of people with things like IBS or IBD, like Crohn's, ulcerative colitis, all, a variety of things. And sometimes we simply have some microbiome type of issues going on, but I often see some nervous system dysregulation that's there. And a lot of us have that because, we live in a really, really busy, fast-paced world these days. And if we have a history of trauma, or even just maybe we had a caregiver who was kind of go, or whatever it was, and we got into this way of coping in our nervous system that maybe doesn't allow for a lot of deactivation or a lot of rest, or what we would call parasympathetic nervous system. That's where we rest and we digest and we sleep well. And if we're not there often, if we're in that other state, more of the sympathetic activated state, this can, as you can see, really affect what's happening with our digestion and start to cause some shifts in our microbiome. Okay. Um, I'm going to look really quick and check in with the questions here in the chat box. Difference between leaky gut and dysbiosis. So leaky gut is more when we're talking about that gut lining, and there can be other things usually there's some other factors at play with leaky gut because something caused there to be intestinal permeability. Basically, things that aren't completely broken down are able to slip through and get into the bloodstream. And another piece to say on the leaky gut part of it is that this is also the picture of autoimmunity and allergies and food sensitivities. Because if we are not, whenever I see a food sensitivity panel and it's like tons of food sensitivities, usually it's not that that person is sensitive to apples and carrots and lettuce and sometimes there's a whole list of stuff that's all these healthy foods showing up as sensitive that they've made antibodies to. Typically what's happening is there's dysfunction in the gut and there's leaky gut because with those gaps, undigested food proteins leak out into the bloodstream and they're not supposed to be there. Those are supposed to be in our gut and broken fully down into amino acids or glucose or vitamins, minerals. So if those are there, the immune system sees them and tags them with an antibody. And now we see that showing up on a food sensitivity test. And secondly, if somebody is predisposed to autoimmunity and we start getting this dysfunction and this inflammation in the gut, that can really, we talked about how much of the immune system is in the gut. The immune system can start to get dysregulated and sometimes get confused and start tagging self tissue, like our thyroid or different things in our body with antibodies and causing damage to those tissues. And so we are always circling back to look at gut health when there's autoimmunity and we're thinking about leaky gut. So that's one point to make there. When we look at dysbiosis, dysbiosis is imbalanced bacteria. So the test for those, there's a couple different things, but a comprehensive data stool analysis is what we would use to look for dysbiosis. It's called a CDSA. And it's looking for good bacteria, opportunistic bacteria, pathogenic bacteria, yeast, parasites, worms, kind of goes through and looks for all of the things that can both support gut health, like the good stuff. Do we have optimal levels of good stuff, or do we have anything problematic that we need to deal with? So that would be more dysbiosis. Then there's a question here about lectins. What role do lectins play in the gut? So yeah, and Dr. Gundry talks a lot about lectins. And so I find, yes, some people have more of an issue with lectins than others. So it's always something to consider. I tend to see though that if we're having like a lot of problems with lectins, there's usually other issues going on. Same thing with histamine. Some people have, mast cell disorder where their immune system, without going into that, essentially they eat high histamine foods, like a charcuterie platter is really high histidine. So it can raise histamine in the body, like aged cheeses and meats and things like that. And if somebody's having issues with that and they're getting flushing or they're getting bloating or anxiety, a lot of times there's some other gut problem happening. And once we deal with that, that kind of calms down. Sometimes it's really a long-term issue with histamine, but usually we can deal with that through the gut. And lectins, I see that same thing where we might have to remove them for a while, but typically as we work on the gut, some of those like healthy foods that contain lectins become better tolerated and we're able to reintroduce those. So yes, hopefully that answers your question. Sometimes we do want to pull those out, but I like to always look deeper too. Because one thing from working in gut health that I've run into is like, I really don't want people's diets to start getting limited because it can cause nutrient deficiencies. It can cause a poor relationship with food. And so I really try to work to keep as much good, healthy food available as possible. And when I'll have people where it's like histamine's bothering them and lectins and this and this and this. And so we have to kind of try to get to the root of that so that we can tolerate as much healthy food as possible. I don't know if anybody's been down that road, but it's not fun when it starts feeling like really limited. I'll look at this one other question and then keep putting your questions in, and I'll circle back at the end too. Can your mucus lining of your gut and or leaky gut be seen by some scanning technology? Good question. I don't think so. Not that I know of as far as like scanning. It's possible though that I don't know about it. So if anybody knows about that, let me know what it's called and I can look into it. The way that we have all been trained in functional medicine, that's what I'm aware of as the best way to look at this stuff, is through a comprehensive stool analysis. Sometimes we do some breath testing to see certain types of bacteria that might be overgrown in the stomach or the small intestine. We will also do blood work. There's some things we can measure in the blood that indicate that there's leaky gut or an issue in the gut. And then the last one would be organic acids testing, which is urine testing, which looks at metabolites of our metabolism, and can kind of identify certain high levels of bacteria or yeast. So there's a question about like, should one eat more plant-based or meat or dairy for gut health? And I would definitely say for gut health that overall, to keep the gut healthy, we want to get plenty of plant foods in. Definitely. That's really important to get those prebiotics, the fiber, all those vitamins and minerals. And then there are some beneficial nutrients in meat and dairy too. And when we're looking at overall health, there's some specific things that we get from meat and dairy that are hard to get from other places. I always want to support people in whatever their personal choices are around food. So vegan, vegetarian, Mediterranean, paleo, right? All of that. And we can work with all of that. And all of those can be a road to a healthy gut. But always we want to have a lot of vegetables, fruits, things like that to feed the gut bacteria. So hopefully that's the short answer to your question, but hopefully that helps. There is, I mentioned this, I think in the last class, but Dr. Mark Hyman, he just came out with a book. He always uses this phrase called the Pegan Diet. And I love it because it's paleo with vegan mashed together. So he talks about like, if we're going for the most nutrient dense foods, we would eat plant-based. We'd get lots, like the rainbow of vegetables, lots of veggies in, lots of seasonal fruits. And, so eating in season, which means sometimes not year round, but getting a couple servings of fruit a day. And then we would eat things like organ meats or wild caught fish, sardines, some of the stuff that doesn't always sound appealing because it's not the standard American animal foods to eat, but they are the most nutrient dense. And traditionally, when we look at hunter-gatherer diets, that's the first part of the animal that would be eaten, or it would be given to like a young couple that just got married because it would promote fertility and things like that. So we would see this kind of around the world in different cultures that those were the most nutrient dense parts. But yes, we can get towards a healthy gut with a lot of different food approaches, but we always want a lot of vegetables. This is just to kind of show on this slide the different areas that our gut supports, or there's something called like the gut axis or the hormone gut axis, the skin gut axis, which just means the connection. We're talking about the gut brain axis mostly today, but the gut is connected to other areas of health too, like our skin health, our metabolism, our appetite, all of those areas. So I thought this was fascinating information. I got some of this from research that was used to write the book, The Gut Mood Connection. And so that's one you can check out. There's a book that really talks a lot about our emotions and our behavior and how our gut impacts that. And there's some studies that looked at what they did was they transferred fecal pellets that had the gut microbiota from an extrovert, an outgoing mouse, and put it into I don't know if any of you have heard of fecal transplants, but they've been used for C. diff and people not recovering from MRSA and some of these antibiotic resistant infections. And they transferred the fecal pellets into So they'll transfer a healthy fecal pellets from one human to another, and it helps them overcome these issues, which is again another fascinating support of how important our microbiome is. And so they've done this in different studies to look at different aspects of our health, including personality. And they found that when they put the extroverted mouse microbiota into the timid mouse, it made it act more gregarious, like the gregarious donor mouse. So it kind of, our bacteria may actually impact our personality. If we take the Myers-Briggs test, it might be in part due to our bacteria. We've seen this too. This has been a study that was around for a while, or that was done a while back, was that transferring stool and its microbes from an overweight mouse with a voracious appetite would trigger, and put into another mouse would trigger a lean mouse with an average appetite to overeat. So we can see that like the lean mouse that didn't have the voracious appetite, it changed once they got that bacteria inside. And I've seen this when we work on gut health, that it can very much affect weight. It can positively or negatively. Some people are low weight and they don't know why they're not able to gain weight. And when we start working on their gut, they're absorbing better and we see them start to gain weight. On the flip side, it can help with weight loss and improve metabolism. It can really have an effect on appetite. So I can tell you in my personal journey, I had issues with binge eating and knowing when I was full. I would always feel hungry and I had like a lot of cravings, especially for sugar. And once I started working on my microbiome, there were some, emotional reasons I was eating. So I had to deal with that. But it took the whole edge away, took the edge off of that feeling of like wanting to eat that food or wanting to eat those things that I knew weren't really great for me and I wouldn't feel good later. And I just didn't seem to want them as much anymore. So it took the edge off of that craving, which is always really interesting when that happens. Okay, so let me see. I want to make sure to share this one with you about probiotics. So I'm going to skip ahead and then we'll come back to those points. So what I do on the nervous system side is called Somatic Experiencing. I'm not sure if any of you have heard of it, but so I can kind of briefly explain what that is. But it is a bottom-up type of approach that therapists use, body workers use. It's a separate training that I went and got because I knew when I went into counseling that I wanted to do nervous system regulation, that I wanted to work with people's organism essentially, especially to help with gut health. And it's a trauma approach. So trauma lives in our nervous system. And so it would also be called trauma therapy. And there is this piece in somatic experiencing that has a lot to do with, I don't know if any of you have had the experience of like sitting down with a friend or going to a counseling session or getting home and talking to a family member and sort of unloading the problem, right? Like we jump in, it's like, oh, this happened today, and then this happened today, and this happened today. And it can feel good to do that. And it's not a bad thing. It can be a really good thing to kind of get that out and to share and to make some meaning out of what happened. Often though, as we're doing that, or if we just kind of go on, we can get in this circle where our nervous system's like, and we're feeling the fight or the flight or all the frustration and all the emotions. And we lose track of like, how do I get out of this? Like, how do I deactivate? And so in somatic experiencing, we spend a lot of time resourcing and finding the relaxation response and noticing when that shows up and spending just as much or usually more time there than we are in the fight flight response or freeze response. So there's this like pendulation back and forth that we can learn in our nervous system. So I came across this study and I was so fascinated by it because probiotics actually help the body do this without us even working on it, right? So we can work on it. But this study illustrated the gut-brain connection and what's happening in our nervous system with probiotics, with that good bacteria. So they fed two groups of mice, were fed different diets. One got a sterile broth and the other received a feed that had Lactobacillus rhamnosus, which is a strain of probiotic, of bacteria that's beneficial to our health. And both of the groups were subjected to a mild water stress test, and mice don't like water. So they were placed in a bowl of water that was deep enough that they couldn't get out, so they would have to swim. And they can float too, so they took them out eventually. But the group who was fed the sterile broth swam for 1 minute, then 2 minutes, then 3 minutes. And about 4 minutes, they just gave up and floated. They went, okay, we don't like this, but we're not going to get out. So they just kind of gave up. And then they took them out of the water because they weren't trying anymore. They were sort of resigned to the unpleasant wet circumstance. The other group that was fed the Lactobacillus rhamnosus, that was fed the bacteria, good bacteria, swam for the same. They swam for 4 minutes, then 5. So they swam the same amount of time, but they kept going and swam for 4 minutes, 5 minutes, 6 minutes. They might have continued swimming, but the researchers removed them because the result was pretty stunning, right? They went double as long and kept going. And so what they found was happening with the mice, they had measured their corticosteroid. So that's a stress hormone. They measured their stress hormone levels, and they measured their GABA neurotransmitter levels. And GABA is calming. So when we get a wave of GABA, we feel relaxed, we feel calm. And as they did that, they found that the mice, that both groups had a significant release of stress hormone when put in the water, but the levels that were fed the probiotics had higher levels of GABA release. So they, in between getting a wave of stress hormone, they got a wave of GABA. Then they got a wave of stress hormone, then they got a wave of GABA. And so I don't know if any of you have felt like your stress go up, 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 up until you're overwhelmed, right? And then we're sort of like, I can't do this anymore. That's what happened without the probiotics. But the ones with the probiotics basically naturally had this extra stress, this resilience in a stressful situation, because they were getting these calming waves to balance out the waves of stress hormone. So how cool is that? They were able to continue through a stressful experience because of getting this back and forth, this pendulation between the stress and the relaxation response. So the takeaway there is that if we've got good bacteria in our gut, we can naturally just have more stress resilience. The hormones in our body are going to do what they need, that we need them to do to get through. Okay. So probably the part that is I always like to include to make sure we get some takeaways. What do we do with all this information? And this is just a little bit, I'm kind of working on putting together hopefully some longer training for counselors or anybody who's interested on the gut-brain connection to go through like more and more of this research and information on it. So I just kind of pulled out some of the pieces that I found really interesting and hopefully gave you some new information about what's going on with our gut and our brain and how those are connected. And then some nutritional strategies that we can do to support this is to eat. We started to talk about eating lots of seasonal fruits and veggies. And one thing I often recommend is to, when you do your shopping, pick a different vegetable each week, like get something that you didn't have the week before. Make sure you look around and check to see if you have 5, 6 different colors, right? Purple, something white, something red, something orange, something green. So that will give you a lot of phytonutrients, and phytonutrients can also feed the bacteria in our gut. Especially all the colorful veggies have a lot of phytonutrients. Fermented and probiotic rich foods, those can be, if you like, a good starting point is a lot of people like pickles. So Bubby's pickles are a fermented and cultured pickle. I will say that getting cultured food at the store is the easiest, but it's a little more expensive and it can be pretty inexpensive to make. So if you ever want to get into culturing your own food, you just need to buy the veggies and the salt and have containers and water. So it can be fairly easy to do. Yogurt is more complicated. There are some that are more complicated, but fermented vegetables are easier. But if you want to pick it up at the store, Bubby's is a good one to start with, or a cultured sauerkraut. You want to look to see that it's refrigerated and that in the ingredients, it has sea salt instead of vinegar. So if it has vinegar and it's shelf stable, meaning it's not in the refrigerated area, it's probably pickled and not actually cultured, and so that it won't have the good bacteria. So you're looking for refrigerated and then sea salt in the ingredients. Oh, I just saw Magda wrote a program on pickling is coming up. Fun. You can include fiber and, oh, one other thing on fermented foods. So there's kimchi, there's sauerkraut, there's other options for fermented vegetables sometimes you can find, or pickles. Magda put it in the chat box. Bubby's is the brand I was mentioning with the pickles. You can also do yogurt or kefir. And there is one I really like that I'll put in the chat box. It is called Inner Eco Coconut Kefir. And I think on the bottle now they have it. It says coconut water. And you do a tablespoon a day. That's a really great way to get some cultured food in. And yes, Carol, kombucha. Kombucha is awesome. There's lots of options for kombucha. So that might be one to try. Include fiber and prebiotics in foods. So some of the high prebiotic vegetables are your onion and garlic family, all of those, like all the range of onions, leeks. Another area would be things like asparagus, dandelion greens. There's one I was trying to think of that left my brain. And then we're getting some in the form of fiber and or phytonutrients in all our vegetables. So keep eating those. Or if you haven't been, you might look around and see what's on sale the next time you go shopping and add something new in. Mindful eating is eating in a state of rest and digest. So sometimes we refer to parasympathetic as rest and digest. That's where our body is when we're like slipping off into a good sleep, when we feel relaxed. And so eating in this state is important. And oftentimes we're eating with other people. So my tips there would be to take 3 deep breaths before you start eating. Notice how the chair feels, notice your body connected to the chair. Feel the bottoms of your feet on the floor. Maybe glance out the window if nature is soothing, or anything that's soothing, check in with that. And then if you notice in the conversation, like I've got 3 little kids, so like they start to argue or something spills, or, there's always like a lot of action happening, and that can be activating for me. I want to just sit and eat, but sometimes there's stuff to deal with. So I just always recommend just put the fork down. And that way you can let your nervous system do what it's going to do and deal with whatever's happening, or have the conversation about some piece of news that might be kind of activating or stressful. And then do what I just said again, like once that feels like it's done, then take the deep breaths, resettle, and then start eating again. And that's one way to just practice mindful eating, so that we're not kind of eating while we're doing all the other stuff and not relaxed. We can aim for a variety of whole foods, which we've somewhat talked about, and also just making sure we get a variety of all the other nutrients and macronutrients that we need. Industrialized seed oils can have a negative impact on our gut, as can trans fats. So trans fats would be found in processed foods or fast food. You just want to look on the ingredient label and avoid partially or fully hydrogenated oils. I'll put that in the chat box. Fully or partially hydrogenated oil. Misspelled oil, but and avoid those if you see them. Usually you can get the same food product, like peanut butter, for example. Some of them have in the past had hydrogenated oil, but you can easily get natural peanut butter that doesn't have it. Also looking for cold pressed unrefined oils is a way to avoid the negative impact of some oils that we cook with. So that's something you can look for when you're buying oils, sticking to things like avocado oil, olive oil, cold press. Thank you, Cheryl. is what you're looking for on the label. And then refined grains and sugars is referring to flour made from grains that's more processed. So cookies, cakes, pastries, all that stuff is made from refined grains. So we're just looking to do more whole grains and avoid more of the refined grains made from flour. And of course, with sugars, minimizing or avoiding those and sticking more to veggies, fruits, whole grains, protein, healthy fats. For nutraceutical strategies, so if you're wanting to supplement or add some extra support to what you're doing, a probiotic, you can do fermented foods. So fermented foods tend to have more transient strains of probiotics, which have a lot of good benefit. They go through, they do what they need to do, and they move on. Probiotics will have human strains, which mean that those are almost like seeding the gut. They plant the seeds that are going to live and populate in our gut. And these are really helpful too. I've actually been going through the Super Gut book and putting together, like making yogurt from some human strains, and by human strains, I just mean that they're strains that live in our gut. And so we can take those strains and they're going to stay there and populate and help. And then those transient strains can be also something beneficial. So both, they're a little different, but they're both supportive. A probiotic would give us more of those strains that take up residence. And so there's a lot out there. Some are not so great. Some are really, really great. And so you can always reach out to me if you have a question about probiotics as far as strains, or like I said, there's some good books like Super Gut or The Brain Maker by Dr. Perlmutter is a very good book that he talks about different strains that are important as well for brain health. Prebiotic powder, like acacia powder, is something that can be taken, ideally we want to get most of our prebiotics from food, but I have a lot of people, and I at one point was doing some prebiotic powder to give some extra support and build a healthy microbiome. For leaky gut, things like slippery elm, licorice, marshmallow root, aloe vera can be very soothing, very healing. If there's issues with any of the lining through our esophagus, through our gut, those can be supportive of our gut lining and that mucosal layer in the gut. And then nutrients like quercetin and zinc carnosine, as well as there's something called immunoglobulins. Those are harder to find. I need them in practice, but that's another thing that can also support the immune system in the gut.
Sorry, if I can interrupt for a second. Somebody is asking, what is the example of industrial seed oils?
Yeah, so the example would be canola oil, corn oil, soy oil, and usually there's these high heat seed oils. So there are a couple of those that you'll see where it'll say cold pressed, unrefined, like they've put that oil together or they've processed that oil differently. But all of the industrial seed oils, including any that say cold pressed and unrefined, are high in omega-6s. And omega-6s are pro-inflammatory. We need some, but we tend to get too much because most restaurants, most processed food uses high omega-6 oil, which is industrial seed oils. And so one big support we can do to both balance inflammation in our body as well as support our gut is to avoid those at home, at least, because you're probably going to get some when you eat out or you get pick up food places. And so avoiding that at home and doing nervous system or stress response specific can be herbs. Ashwagandha is one that's very calming. Lavender oil, or there's actually a lavender supplement that can be taken. Phosphatidylserine, and there is a whole slew that I would put in here, like passion flower, lemon balm. There's a bunch that have an effect on our nervous system, and I won't go into those today. But I mentioned a few here, and just know that they're out there, and maybe that's something down the road we can do more on. But those are also options if it feels like gut health is being impacted by nervous system and stress type responses. Some body-based therapy techniques that help with the nervous system too. We mostly talked about, we did talk about somatic experiencing. There's things like tapping, also known as emotional freedom technique, EFT, EMDR. A lot of this is helping, and I had done this class for some practitioners, so I put helping clients slow their bodies down. But slowing down in general, right? The world is fast. So when we kind of actively slow ourselves down, we can do this through a yoga class. We can do this just through mindfulness throughout our day. We can kind of notice what we feel in our body in terms of sensation, and then figure out what we need to do with that. Notice areas of tension, get out and do some exercise if that helps to release that tension. So lots of awareness and mindfulness, I think, and then lots of ways to do that through different practices. I'm gonna go to questions because that's kind of wraps up the piece I wanted to share today.
If I can interject, sorry, I forgot to say at the beginning, if you need wellness points from you, G, please give me your email address in the chat room. If you have no idea what this means, it means you are probably not, you do not need wellness points. So just ignore it. Sorry.
That's okay. Yeah, so we'll do some questions. Hopefully you got some takeaways today that you can kind of implement or think about. And then there's a question, how can I find a functional specialist here in Kansas City in Johnson County? It depends what kind of functional specialist you want. So there are many different types. We kind of talked about this a couple weeks ago. It depends if you're wanting someone to manage like medication. I would look for an MD or a DO if you're on medications or you're dealing with surgeries and you need like medical input, and I would do that. If you're wanting more nutrition, you can find a dietitian or a nutritionist. So I do functional medicine more on the nutrition side. We're all trained the same way, so we do a lot of similar assessment, but obviously my protocols or plans are going to be nutrition, lifestyle, and supplement related. And if there's medications, I can work with someone's physician to figure that out. But it kind of depends what you're looking for. There are also counselors that do functional medicine. So I would say maybe if you need a referral, feel free to reach out to me. I'll put my email in the chat box, and if I can help, I will, or I can give you a referral for what you're looking for. So my email is brooke@evolvewellnesskc.com. I always do a 15-minute or 20-minute free consult. So we can always just schedule time to chat. And I have some different resources. I have a referral list. So if it's something you're looking for, we can also get that sorted. MD for multiple autoimmune. Okay, yeah, reach out. Why don't you email me and I can send you my referral list. Let's see, pine nut oil for ongoing COVID gut inflammation. I would have to research that. I have not read anything about that yet. So could be totally a thing, but I'm not aware of it yet. Any other questions before we wrap up?
So I do not see any, but since you mentioned Ayurveda, I have a shameless plug. In June, we have 4 sessions on Ayurvedic medicine by a practitioner from Austin. She studied in India and she has been practicing it for many years. So if you are interested in Ayurveda, check out our calendar for June. Thank you.
And there was one more question from Melanie that I had missed. So the question is, recently tested and am intolerant of yeast, both bakers and brewers, and candida overgrowth. So what happens with that is when we see candida overgrowth, sometimes there's not a sensitivity to yeast, but if that Candida overgrowth has been there long enough, the immune system has started reacting to yeast. And so eaten yeast in food can cause a reaction. Sounds like you're having both of those. And so things like caprylic acid, grapeseed extract, berberine can bring down levels of yeast. And then typically we have to kind of avoid yeast in food for a while. And over time, sometimes that resolves once the yeast overgrowth or the Candida overgrowth has been dealt with for a while. So that's my quick and short answer. But there's a lot of other things. Food wise, I would definitely avoid sugar and more sugars and refined flours for that. Did I answer? Hopefully I answered your question. Then there's one more. Does intermittent fasting upset the gut? Intermittent fasting should give the gut time to take a break. So the only way it would upset it is if blood sugar's dropping because the body's really not ready to do that and needs some more regular fuel. And then cortisol's going up. And if that stress hormone's going up, that might upset the gut. So that could happen. Sometimes some of the oils people have when they're intermittent fasting can upset the gut. So I don't know if that's a factor. What do you think, Magda? I see one more question. I know we're a little after one.
Go for it. This is, yeah, of course.
Okay.
Of course.
Okay. Our upper GI colonoscopy is going to reveal digestive issues with vegetables. Not necessarily. So colonoscopies and endoscopies look more at structure. So they can see the tissue. And oftentimes they can see that there's like inflammation or damage in the tissue, which is good to know and important to identify. But they don't they're not really telling us much about the microbiome. And so if there's a microbiome issue that's causing a problem with vegetables, we probably won't find it out from that. That would be more of like a stool analysis that we would need.
All right. Well, Ramona, I think, summarized it the most. She said it was the best of information. Thank you so much, Brooke. And see you again May 24th. Thank you everyone for participating.